Hi, I'm Will Rogers, Chair of the Rail Forum, and I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Haines for this introductory vlog to Rail Safety Week. So you've worked in railway operations and the industry for a long period of time.
Yeah.
What does rail safety mean personally to you, that sort of that deep point?
Well, the Network Rail vision is everyone home safe every day. And it's a really powerful message because, of course, it applies to our customers and it applies to not just our colleagues, but our wider industry colleagues as well. There's about 200,000 people in the broader rail sector, if you think of all the rail forums, members and train operators, Network Rail. And between us, we will move from 1.7 billion, 1.8 billion passengers this coming year. Keeping everyone safe home every day is a phenomenally important moral obligation, and also one that requires you to look at different risks. And so it's a moral imperative, but it's also a big managerial challenge to say, what's the best way of doing that in 2025? The risks we've got today are not the risks we had 15 years ago. They're not the risks we had 30 years ago. It's if you can really live that, keeping everyone home safe every day, it's a phenomenal platform on which to build.
It is a huge duty, isn't it, when you talk about that number of people?
Absolutely.
And we are personally responsible for their
accountable
safety.
For that.
Yeah. And when you talk about how things have changed over time, is there a turning point that you reflect on that's really shaped some of your views when it comes to safety?
For me, I would say there have probably been three big moments in my career that have really shaped my approach to safety. The first was Ladbroke Grove in October 1999, and I can remember the room I was sat in, maybe a few hundred yards away from me on Friarsbridge Court, when I heard about that. And that was, the system safety elements of that, the way that the signalling a layout to being commissioned, the issues about how we train drivers, and the opportunities to do something about that, and understanding all too often when people die, it's because the system risks are not well aligned. And that was for me, that was a massive driver of understanding system risk. Second one was when I was at the CAA and we had the Icelandic volcano that lots of people can identify with. And that was another piece of system risk. The reason people got stranded all over Europe, and in fact all over the globe, wasn't really because there was a known safety issue. There was an undefined safety issue. And because in aviation and aerospace hadn't properly calibrated that safety risk, aviation came to a halt because it hadn't addressed that risk. So to me, it was a real opener about, you've got to think about the consequences of not having addressed safety risk. It's not enough to say, well, that will never happen. And I think all too often we think that will never happen. And that was a good example. I mean, phenomenal economic damage done. Great if you happen to be stuck on a beach somewhere, had another week's free holiday. But for a lot of people, it was much more painful than that. Yeah. And then the third one would be, and I still find it quite hard, quite emotional even now talking about it, when we had two colleagues lose their lives in Margam in South Wales within my first year of joining this business. And having to sit in the front room of the house of one of the families the following day and talk to them and see the level of resistance there was in my own business to change, and realizing actually that sometimes you have to direct change. There's a huge amount of good stuff talked about getting buy-in and embracing. But every now and again, you get to a moment where you just have to say, enough is enough. We have to do something. And the changes we made to track worker safety have come at a very, very significant cost. It's come to, in terms of financial cost, in terms of operational flexibility sometimes, in terms of other things we haven't been able to spend the money on. But it was a real wake-up call to say, all the time we'd been nudging people to change behaviours, it wasn't enough. And sometimes leaders have to step in and say enough is enough. And those were probably the 3 big moments in my life that have shaped my approach to safety.
And they are really significant events that you're describing there.
Yes.
Andrew. And you know, you reflect on there's a lot in there around change, the complexity of the system. And then there's that really personal bit, because it really, really does matter. So sort of moving on around that point about track worker safety, Network Rail's got tens of thousands of employees, and often they're working in environments...
And many more contractors, by the way.
Of course,
you know, on top, so
And often working in quite hazardous environments with quite a lot of risk. So what are the kind of investments that Network Rail has made over recent years to help try and reduce that risk profile?
Well, look, I would say there are sort of 3 different types of things. The first is to use technology so that we don't need to put people in places of harm, and that's both passengers and colleagues. So if you look at, we get about 1/10 of the number of broken rails we were getting 20 years ago. So the disciplines of that, but the quality of on-track machinery, and we're just about on the cusp of we're just about to go out to tender for a next generation of yellow train. You know, the ability to use technology now to predict failure, to keep people away from harm. Then the stuff that we use to protect people, we're just rolling out geofencing, for example, so that we still get too many near misses. When in your, in the East Midlands region, not so long back, were people in the wrong place. They thought they were in one place, they were actually on the wrong line. So simple things like geofencing actually can be very good at protecting people. A lot of diagnostic equipment. There's a huge plethora, much of which we sometimes think of as not being directly related to safety, but what it's to do with is asset condition. And of course, that affects both reliability but safety as well. What I learned in the aviation industry, and of course it's blindingly obvious, is airplanes are phenomenally reliable, because if an unreliable piece of kit in an aircraft is life and death, it's a bit binary. So aircrafts are certified to sort of 10 to the -7 levels of reliability. In the railway, we don't buy that level of reliability. But that means we have to be more conscious so we're not buying the safety either. So we have, what we're looking to do is fill the technology gaps to make sure that you get both reliability and safety together.
I think it's a really interesting reflection when you describe, the system. And if you've got an unreliable system, it's going to rely on people doing more work in risky places.
You intervene, absolutely.
That point where you go, it's more reliable, and it's then symbiotic, that point about performance and safety.
You disrupt the timetable. You actually end up then reducing your maintenance window because the last train is late, so you get less time to maintain the track. Something else happens on the back of that, and all too often we know in safety, when you get significant safety incidents, it's the Swiss cheese model, isn't it? It's all the holes that you hope will never line up, and then so the failure current passes through.
And of course, and when you think bigger systems, that we sometimes then will pass risk to other transport modes as well.
Absolutely.
With passengers on rail replacement, etc.
No, indeed, absolutely.
So we touched a lot.
Or drive people to the road because of unreliability or unaffordability. If we spend too much money on a theoretical safety risk that isn't really there, we price people onto a less reliable form of transport, a less safe form of transport. You have to look at safety. Safety does not come at any price, because that's an illusion. You do that, you drive people off the railway onto roads where they're far, far more likely to come to harm.
Yes, absolutely. So we talked quite a lot about physical safety and kit and plant. When we just think a little bit more about, and I think I reflect a lot on well-being. And I think the well-being sort of agenda's moved forward quite significantly in recent years. So when it comes to things like psychological safety, how have you seen that change recently?
I think we're still on a journey on psychological safety. I mean, we're the sort of industry actually where it's really, really, really important, because much of the work that people do in the rail industry is unsupervised. They're not watched over.
A lot of trust there, isn't there?
So there's a huge amount of trust. And it's all too, if people don't feel safe about declaring vulnerability, unsafe working practices, lack of knowledge, then the chances of somebody else knowing about it are much, much lower than they are if you're working in a factory environment or an office environment or somewhere where you're very heavily supervised. So the prize with psychological safety on the railway is greater than it is in many other places. It also, though, is, I think, really important because, you know, there's a lot of talk is about growth mindset and the extent to which you can learn from, you know, the extent to which you approach a problem or in denial about it, or you say, hang on, this is something I can learn from. And psychological safety and growth mindset go very, very closely together. I try now to write to people who put their hands up about things, just to say, thank you for sharing your experience and being prepared to be vulnerable, because it's too easy to not do that. And I think we're still on a massive journey if we're really honest. And by the way, aviation was the same. We used to have at the CAA, where we were the safety regulator, there was this thing called mandatory occurrence reporting. And we used to say it was the gold star of sort of industry safety. But when I said what percentage of mandatory occurrence reports were people reporting their own failure, it was absolutely tiny.
Yeah.
It was normally a piece of kit they reported. Very, very occasionally it'd be reporting somebody else's failure. But the extent to which people were comfortable about saying, I did that wrong because I was in the wrong place, or I had the wrong level of training, or the kit, or I had a memory lapse, or I was tired, it's tiny. So I think, you know, that is one of the areas where I think we're still in the foothills, and it's so, so important. And of course, for leaders like ourselves, it's really important that you create the right climate there. One wrong step in terms of clamping down on things or getting angry with people can have a really, really negative ripple. So I find that, you know, sometimes I have to have my hands tied behind my back to make sure that I take 5 and stop and think about how I respond to a situation.
I think it's a really critical point that you make here, Andrew, about how you create that environment where we can have the right conversations, because quite a lot of this is deep, it's quite personal, and we've got to make it safe for people to put their hands up, because if there's things we don't know about, they're definitely not going to be solving those issues.
I remember an example probably 4 or 5 months back now, where we had a signaller who self-declared an irregularity, and we wouldn't have known about it if he didn't. And of course, we then ended up DNA testing him, because that's what our rules say. But I thought, does that person feel valued and respected for declaring the irregularity now, or does he feel somehow demonized? And you can say, yes, some of the DNA is only for his protection and benefit. But it really struck me as an example of somewhere whereby we DNA for good reason, but is that a signal to people that actually know you should self-declare, you know, if you've got a problem? Or is it, well, you know, no, we come down and assume that you're doing something wrong? And
it feels like a punishment as opposed to
it will feel like we don't trust you. There must be some reason.
Yes.
So navigating those, they're not easy things to navigate.
No. And then thinking a little bit more about our workforce. A lot of the work that our teams do is really quite challenging. Both the conditions they're working in, things like fatigue, they might get abused as well. Really, really difficult situations.
Weather,
our teams working
you know, foul weather.
And so, what more do you think we can do to support our teams beyond that point we've made about creating the right environment for the right conversations?
So, you know, one of the weirdest things about my job in Network Rail is I have quarterly business reviews with my Midland regions. And any other job I've had as a chief executive, you're always trying to keep a tight control on headcount. Here, I have to go there and beg them to recruit people. We have a culture of that's over-reliant on overtime. And I think that does harm. So I think sometimes we put people under undue pressure because we're not fulfilling vacancies. So I think the first thing we can do for people is make sure we fill the jobs we've committed to. I think you then need a modern approach to fatigue. That's one of the things I learned from my time in aviation. Fatigue doesn't start and end with your shift. If you've had a really rough night for something, if your commute is 2 hours and then you've got a 12-hour shift, you know, you've got a 16-hour day if you're not careful before that. And we don't work through those issues with people. All the evidence is, you know, there was a tragic accident in New York about 15 years ago now, where, you know, because of the rates of pay for the first officer, they were sleeping. They were commuting from Seattle to Newark and sleeping on the floor of the mess room. You know, the roster wasn't the issue. It was the lifestyle that was being sustained by that. So you've got to look at the whole system. That's not easy.
Yeah.
You know, but we do have to, if you're really looking at mental health and looking at well-being and fatigue, you've really got to look at the whole lifestyle issue with the individual.
Absolutely.
And again, that requires people to be open, doesn't it? The psychological safety.
I mean, what's going on at home?
Yeah.
Outside of what's happening in work, it's a really important part of the overall picture.
And sometimes we have people who are brilliant at that, and we have managers who are really finely attuned.
Yeah.
And other times we just think, no, you just follow this process.
Yeah.
And the process by itself isn't enough.
Yeah.
There is no equation that tells you whether or not somebody's fatigued or not. My levels of sleep requirements may be different to yours.
Yeah. Yeah. And this comes back to leadership as well,
Yeah,
isn't it?
absolutely.
Really, really important.
Yeah.
Two final things to reflect on. We talked quite a lot about how the industry's changed, and of course, a lot of change is coming.
Absolutely.
So what's a message that you would give to aspiring safety leaders in the future?
So I think I would say a couple of things. First of all, I'm a massive advocate of Great British Railways, because I think, we've a huge amount of good's been done in the last 30 years since the privatisation model. But I genuinely believe we've come to a point where we've had most of the benefits and we're now left with all the friction costs. Yeah. And that's a massive distraction. And I think a simpler railway that has much less contractual interface, much better aligned incentives, creates space for people to thrive. And I think it creates financial opportunity for us to invest, but it also creates more rewarding jobs, not less frustrating jobs. So I think that's the first thing I would say. Embrace GBR as an opportunity to create simplicity. Second thing I would say is we've got to use technology. We are on the cusp of an AI revolution in the rest of society. Why would we turn our backs against it in the railway? Or why would we think that somehow we want to be in the third tranche or the fourth or the fifth tranche? When it comes to understanding safety risk, we should be using data. It's why we're approaching weather-related risks differently in Network Rail now, because we've got data that we can use. So use that technological transformation to keep people safer. And then the third thing is, remember, we're all human. The first duty of a government is to look after its citizens. And in many ways, the first duty of a line manager is to make sure they understand what makes the individual work for them tick, what gets the best out of them. It doesn't mean you can pander to everything they need. It doesn't mean that every one of your staff will be an angel, or indeed that there's a place for all of them. But understanding, how to get the best out of those individuals, particularly in a safety environment, that is so, so important. Yeah. I think that's one of the things I've learned. And of course, sometimes you learn that the hard way, but if some people can take something from that, then, better for them to learn from me rather than from some horror.
I think those are really helpful themes, embracing change, embracing technology, and understanding people, really, really strong themes. The final question, in terms of your career, what's the legacy that you want to be known for, Andrew?
I don't want to be known at all. Literally, I want to slide away and people forget I'm here.
So what are you going to be proud about then when you've slid away?
I'm proud of what the industry has done. If I'm really honest, I joined the industry 40 years ago in September. I'll be leaving, 40 years and one month. And and when I joined, the industry was in decline. We were shut. We were still closing lines. Trains were known as old, dirty, and late. Passenger numbers were still in free fall, and continued to for another 5, 6, 7 years. We beat ourselves up at the moment about not being the industry we want to be, and that's right, because we should be aspirational. Yeah. But we are utterly, utterly different from that from that industry. And I hear too many people hark back to a previous railway as if somehow it was better. Train service performance levels now, nothing like what they ought to be, but they are very much better than they were 40 years ago. Fact. Passenger satisfaction, better. Quality of service. If you're a person with accessibility needs, then we're nothing like good enough, but it's a sea change from where we are. We are building new railway lines. We're building new stations. We're introducing new technologies. Because the system, the society has changed, so the way that the place for the railways is our economy is now much more dependent upon the railways than it was when I joined.
Yeah.
And that have been part of that, has been a huge privilege and a pleasure and a great deal of fun. And I'd much rather reflect on how the railways changed than any tiny part I'll have played in that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's a great sense of pride.
Yeah.
So Andrew, thank you very much
Thank you.
for this. Your personal commitment to safety is really, really clear. And also, I really thank you for the personal reflections you've provided in this short vlog. So, Rail Safety Week's coming. Please do get behind it and let's work together to make a better, safer railway for everyone. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.